What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is David Ramsden-Wood here for another episode of the Hot Take of the Day podcast. And I'm really excited today because I have someone I've been chatting with, I guess, over the last year, and whose articles and opinion pieces in Forbes and other publications I really enjoy. David Blackmon, how are you? Great to have you here, host of the In the Oil Patch podcast. I was on it last week. It's great to see you. How are you?
Oh, great. Yeah, that was a great interview we had on in the oil patch. I hope everybody gets a chance to catch it. Cheap commercial there, opportunity.
That's what we're doing. I just actually posted on LinkedIn coming into this. And the reason I reached out, we've talked about getting you on because I think you've written a lot of really interesting pieces and talking about the energy. Why don't you first, for people who don't know you and haven't read your stuff necessarily, if they've been living under a rock for a while, why don't you introduce you and what you do and where your focus has been in the energy industry for the last part of your career?
Sure. Well, I'm a semi-retired former government affairs and communications professional in the oil and gas industry. I had a 40-year career there. Took advantage of a little early retirement opportunity out of Lynn Energy a few years ago, and moved back to North Texas to be close to our family with my wife, Terry. And since that time, I do a little consulting still in the industry. I, as you mentioned, write at Forbes.com on energy-related issues, especially as they relate to public policy, tends to be my area of focus. And I'm also the editor for Shale Magazine, which is a regional publication here based in San Antonio here in Texas. We focus on topics impacting the shale business here in the United States mainly. And spend a lot of time on Texas, but also talk about the Marcellus Shale and DJ Basin, the Bakken, all the various shale plays around the country. I have 20 years experience as a lobbyist in Austin. So I do write a lot about what's going on in Austin. And as you've noted, have spent a lot of time in energy writing about the grid crisis here in Texas that keeps rearing its ugly head in so many different ways. We have a real mess down here, and I'm not really sure how that's all going to shake out. But that's been basically my favorite topic here over the last couple of months since I lost power in my own home for 4 days during that freeze event in mid-February. So. Basically, I have a lot of fun talking and writing, and really enjoy what I do, and am very fortunate to be able to do it.
I love that. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with ERCOT. It's a lot has been covered since the February crisis, and we talked about it on your radio program. Which congratulations! Yep. It's now. Remind me, how many radio stations is it now being carried by? It's quite a number.
Yeah, well, we're statewide right now in Texas. We're about to have that expanded on other stations across the country through iHeartRadio. We're part of the iHeartRadio mix, and we've been the highest rated program in Houston on Sunday evenings for the last couple of years. We air in markets all across Texas right now. So I'm not really sure how many stations at the moment, but
a lot. Well, iHeartRadio means that you're in every phone across the planet. So yeah. As long as they can get power. So let's go back just briefly to remind listeners, it's February 11th. We know that the polar vortex, clearly due to the climate emergency, now that it's been renamed by the American Scientific Institute, I think. But clearly the polar vortex is rearing towards Texas, and power goes down. Natural gas prices across the country go up for a lot of reasons. Yep. Lots of utility companies, some go bankrupt, some wind companies are now going bankrupt, going through force majeure, contracts broken, whole bunch of things. Give us your take on the failures at the time, and then the subsequent resignations from the ERCOT officers that followed, before we get to what I think is fascinating this week in Texas.
Oh, yeah. Well, so as you said, the first of 3 major cold fronts rolled into Texas on February 11th, which coincidentally was the day after the ERCOT board had met on February 10th and spent all of 43 seconds of a 2-hour long meeting talking about emergency preparedness. And that's not a typo. It's not an exaggeration. They talked about it for 43 seconds out of
And
a
I
2
assume
hour
it was
meeting.
a Zoom, right? It was
It was a
also,
Zoom.
it was
Yeah.
not in person, people, bombing around, taking care of their dogs,
Right.
getting ready to pick up their kids, whatever it is. So
Sure. Yeah. And of course, for people who don't know, the ERCOT board is a 15-member board, 6 of whom didn't even live in the state of Texas. ERCOT is it's a 501c4 organization that reports to the Texas government through the Public Utility Commission, which is a 3-member board that only has 1 member right. No, actually has 2 members as of today now. And in the wake of the disastrous freeze event, which saw over 4 million Texans lose power for days at a time, not just a few hours at a time, as ERCOT warned us would happen, and 200 Texans lose their lives as a result of having no heat in their homes, and for days afterwards, no water, no drinking water that they could drink. 200 Texans perished as a result of this complete, utter clown show that went on in the Texas grid for that period of time. We had freeze ups of a vast portion of our wind power capacity here in the state. We had freeze ups of a good portion of our natural gas power generating capacity, and several natural gas pipelines froze up as a result of temperatures that reached into below zero, not just below freezing, but below zero temperatures here in Texas, which is a very rare thing. So the fact is that ERCOT simply was not prepared. The grid wasn't prepared. ERCOT had no real plan in place for reasons that are mysterious to me that we can talk about, why they would have no plan in place for such a weather event, since it does take place about once a decade here in Texas, this kind of weather. And as a result, people died. People weren't just cold and shivering in their homes, people died. And that's a really serious thing. So I wrote my first piece about it on the morning of, of February 15th, which was.
Did you use a typewriter? Yeah.
Well, I had to go to my daughter's house because we had no power, but my daughter lives close by, and they had power. So I had to go over there to write it, and have been writing about it ever since. I think I've written 9 total pieces now at Forbes.com and several over at shalemag.com as well.
What I find so interesting about that, because again, I always find crisis makes things obvious that didn't make sense. And as weird as this is, I think one of the things that's going to come out of COVID for me that actually is a pretty good idea is the dividers between like us and grocery store workers, or like the plexiglass that they've kind of erected, like that it's kind of obvious. It's kind of like thinking back to pre-2001 with like, how obvious is it that like if someone could use box cutters to take down a plane, we should probably have some level of security in the airports. And so in some parts, crises allow us to get better. But it is some of the shocking decisions. Of course, some pipelines freeze because you have, whether it's surface lines or risers that aren't heat traced. I can see that. But what to me was so bizarre was the cascading. We need to save all the power for homes, so we're going to shut off power to saltwater disposal and to ESPs, which are the ones that are producing the gas to produce the power. And
to big compressor stations as well, all those pipelines.
And so I was reached out to by a number of operators who talked about, and ultimately I think Texas Gas went from, my number's not total, but it's like somewhere between 20 to 25 BCF a day is what they produce, and it was producing 10. So clearly some was frozen, but also the infrastructure just was woefully not prepared. And it's truly amazing that that ERCOT had never thought through where the natural gas even comes from. Beyond the coal.
It's inexcusable. It's not just amazing, it's inexcusable.
Yeah. So subsequent to that, we saw articles, and I know we talked about this on the radio show, so we won't belabor it, but immediately as soon as this crisis happens, there's articles in the news that no, wind didn't fail, solar didn't fail. And my favorite quote of the whole thing is, they worked as expected in February. Now, can you illuminate us as to what as expected in February can mean?
Well, I guess as expected in a major freeze event like that is that they don't work because they didn't work. We lost, at one point, we had lost upwards of 80% of the wind power in this state, which is a significant part of the grid, of our capacity because ERCOT and Texas government have spent so much energy and billions of dollars promoting wind and discouraging the construction of baseload here in Texas so we can brag about our emissions profile. Meanwhile, we haven't built any baseload in 10 years. And when you have a big freeze event, the wind goes down, the solar gets covered up with snow and it goes offline. A third of the natural gas went offline too. But guess what? Natural gas was the only reason the whole grid didn't collapse. Because at one point, natural gas was supplying more than 70% of the electricity that was being generated in this state. So it's so fascinating to me that the people in the wind community, and you and I were just dialoguing with one of them on LinkedIn yesterday, just cannot make themselves admit that, the whole theme of my stuff in Forbes has been that everything failed, okay?
Absolutely.
It all failed.
All failed.
All failed to some extent. Why can't the people in the wind community admit that? You failed.
Yeah.
This isn't hard. You left people in the cold and the dark.
Well,
and if that's what the expectation is, then you're kind of useless when it really matters.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing, so again, we can skip the subsidies, and I believe Warren Buffett was quoted as saying, of course people are investing in wind because there's a credit. And as I've read, so fact check me on this, but there is a 2 cent a kilowatt hour federal subsidy to wind production.
Yeah.
And so in a wholesale market like in Texas, there are times when perhaps it's super windy in the summer and it's super sunny and you are producing way more power than you need. And so like in California, when that happens, because they have so much solar and it's sunny, then they send that over to Arizona and pay them to take it. But in the wind's case, they have a 2 cent a kilowatt hour subsidy, which means that even when prices are negative 1 cent and natural gas would be turned off, wind producers can still make money. But of the 29,000 megawatts of capacity, it was producing something like 7, as low as 2 or 3. And again, the phrase is as expected. And the temperatures were only 0 degrees. One of the things that I always find fascinating, and I wanted your comments on, is in California, because it's a very temperate climate. I was in Oregon this weekend, which is not California, but it's quite far north. We were on the coast. And they said it snows once every 5 years. So Bandon Dunes is open like every month of the year. Temperatures are kind of 50 to 70. It's very windy in the summer. I can't imagine what very windy is because really like when normal wind was very windy. But because of the temperate climates and everyone lives so close to the coast and not in the desert, California themselves uses half the power of other places where it gets hotter like Texas or in Minnesota where it gets super cold. And the degree heating to get Minnesota from minus 30 to 65 or 70 inside is massive. Texas was only down to 0. And you can't turn wind and solar off. Why do you think that no one is having that honest conversation around our energy? Because it's so clear that this is not hard. Well, what is going on in your opinion?
Well, I think a lot of it just has to do with the way the news media covers it. I'm very critical of the news media for many reasons. The whole climate emergency campaign we see building up is one of them. It's all of it, the narrative is more important than the facts. And so the narrative the media has been pushing for the last 20 years is that the climate is warming and we have to focus on things like wind and solar to reduce our emissions. And we have to cut off coal and natural gas because they produce emissions. So wind is good, natural gas is bad. And that's why, I think that intimidates policymakers to a large extent because they know if they start speaking critically of wind power, that they're going to have negative media days. The coverage of what they say is going to be negative, and I think it has the impact of squelching real honest debate about what's best for the energy sector going forward. Is the climate changing? I guess it is. I mean, smarter people than me say it is. And do we need to do something about that? I guess we do. But it strikes me that I don't really see anyone who really knows what those things really are. Mm-hmm. We see an awful lot of talking points and propaganda being put out, but we also see situations continuing to crop up, like we just saw this week in Texas, in which this heavy focus on having renewables on the grid isn't really doing anything to enhance reliability on the grid. In fact, is having a negative impact on it. And I think that's what we saw this week in Texas.
So we're gonna let's talk about this week in Texas. Before, I want to tie back to narrative and chat a little bit about that, because we talk about it a lot here, and I captured all as intellectual inconsistency. So we'll come back to that in a second. But so this week you wrote two pieces because ERCOT sent out a power warning in April. Now, I love going to Houston in April because it's like 82. You can go golfing. It's not that humid. It's like basically the perfect climate from September to April, May. May, June is when it gets downright inhospitable, and July and August is
it's almost unbearable,
as you know. And yet there was a power warning this week times 2. Talk to us about what happened and what your pieces were writing about.
Yeah. So as you say, I mean, we're not used to getting power warnings in April in Texas. The warnings were issued on Tuesday and Wednesday, the 13th and 14th, I guess that would be. The April 13th, which was a day in which ERCOT said it was perilously close to not having enough generating capacity to meet demand, was probably about the mildest weather day you could hope to have in a geographic area as vast as Texas. It's 800 miles across, east and west, 750 north to south. It's a very big place, and we rarely have a day in Texas where not 1 square inch of soil is experiencing some sort of severe weather, either high temperatures or below freezing temperatures or severe thunderstorms or something like that. But on April 13th was one of those days. There was not a square inch of soil in the state of Texas that had any kind of severe weather going on. And yet our grid manager, quote, managers, who were supposed to ensure, quote, reliability on our power grid, sent out a warning asking us all to conserve electricity because they were about to run out of the necessary capacity to meet demand. Now, what happened as a practical matter was that roughly a third of the natural gas and coal generating capacity in the state was offline for maintenance. Now, about a third of that capacity was due to damages experienced during the February freeze event, and they were making repairs. But 2/3 of it was just general periodic maintenance that proper planning by ERCOT would have said, oh, you know what, maybe we need to have this plant and that plant and this plant stay online just in case something happens. But what they did instead was just assume that, going back to the as expected performance of wind and solar, what they did was look at their models and say, well, our model tells us we're going to have 11 gigawatts of wind power online, and I think something around 3 of solar online. And gosh, that's going to give us enough to fill in whatever might come up. Well, what actually happened on the 13th was that the wind stopped blowing in West Texas and in South Texas, where the other big wind farms are. And we ended up only with 6 gigawatts on the grid on the 13th of wind, and roughly 1.8 to 2 of solar. And so, they found themselves short, and we almost ended up with rolling blackouts on the mildest weather day we're probably going to have all year in Texas. The second day, on the 14th, the weather was a little different. You know, we had some higher heat temperatures in South Texas. We had a little more, some actual real thunderstorms going on in North Texas, but more capacity had come back online, more base load. And even though they sent out kind of a preliminary warning, they didn't have to ask people to conserve. So the 14th was a little better, but still, it's the middle of April, okay? If we had adequate baseload reserve capacity, which we don't, those warnings would have been unnecessary. We would have never gotten any kind of warning calls or emails or tweets from ERCOT. But the simple fact is the state of Texas has actually retired more baseload capacity over the last 10 years than we have built. We've had a net negative baseload capacity equation over a decade at a time during which our population expanded by 20%. Well, that's not sustainable. I mean, it just simply is not sustainable. And so when you get right down to it, our government and the people at ERCOT just have to stop virtue signaling about all the renewables we're putting onto our grid and make whatever reforms are necessary to get more baseload built. And baseload is not wind and it's not solar, it's natural gas or it's coal or it's nuclear. And that's what it is. And that's what we have to do to stabilize our grid.
So it's really interesting because how you read a lot about the rest. It's amazing how worried everyone is about everyone else. And you know, whether it's America worried about global warming, the reality is, and this is the very Darwinian Machiavellian thing to say, but the reality is, if the world warms, the US is more hospitable and so is Canada. Therefore, our growing season is longer. We have the best technology there already is. We can grow more food locally, and global warming would actually be probably net good, except for sea level rises to coastal cities, which quite frankly, with the trillions of dollars we're parachuting in for COVID stimulus, you could probably manage some pump systems and some levees around New York and Miami.
Sure.
And be in a net positive. But how much do you think when New York and California say, well, it's because Texas wants to be Texas and they're not on the full grid, so they're not pulling power in from other places? Because you hear that a lot. What do you make of that?
Well, I guess that would have been helpful in February. Although, where would we be pulling from? We'd have been pulling from Louisiana and Arkansas and Oklahoma and New Mexico, and they were all freezing too.
And Colorado.
Colorado, and I'm not sure those states, the generating capacity in those states wasn't already all used up anyway. What we need to do in Texas is fix our own grid. We've made our own grid. We've been on our own grid for a long time. We never had these problems until we created this deregulated market. Okay, we never had. My God, we had 12 inches of snow and a week of below 20-degree weather in San Antonio in 1984, and nobody lost electricity. Okay, I mean, these are recent phenomenon on the Texas grid that have only begun happening after we began subsidizing the building of wind power. Okay, and no, I'm not blaming it all on wind. We need renewables. They're an integral part of the grid now. But these kinds of problems have only begun to happen since we began diversifying the grid in this state. Okay, so we obviously have a bad management problem and a bad planning problem. That's the problems we have, and they have created a severe shortage of reserve baseload capacity, and that's only going to be fixed by government mandate because the free market system in Texas isn't creating the market signals necessary to encourage the private sector to build more baseload power. So it's up to the government now to act. We're in the middle of a legislative session, and hopefully the legislature will get to an agreement on some real solutions here.
So what did you make of the Warren Buffett comment in the weeks following the February freeze, where he said, we're going to, I mean, it wasn't him, but his companies, said, we're going to come in and build 8 natural gas plants that are just there for backup, just to help, which I found interesting for a couple reasons. And the first is Berkshire hasn't signed on really to a climate pledge. Number 2, they're a huge investor in companies like Coca-Cola, when definitively sugar and corn syrup are one of the leading contributors to the obesity pandemic, which is the leading contributor to COVID. So, and whether they sign on for climate or not, all of a sudden there are returns to be generated, and it's interesting to go invest, which is why investors want to see wind and solar get built and coal plants that they don't own get decommissioned, because also utility companies, when they decommission them, they pass the costs on to consumers anyway. But what did you take away from Warren Buffett's companies stepping up and saying, hey, we're here to help and we're going to go build some gas-fired generation?
Well, I actually like it. I'll be honest with you. I've responded very positively to that for several reasons. Number one, Berkshire Hathaway is not currently a power generator in Texas. And in my view, the reason our government did nothing after the 2011 major freeze event, in which we had rolling blackouts, and the legislature did not do anything to fix the grid, was because the current set of power generators in this state didn't want them to, okay? And I was personally involved in the aftermath of that deal as a lobbyist on energy issues in the Texas legislature, and saw it all happen in real time, all the disinformation that got distributed to the legislature by the power generator community, and which was designed simply to run out the clock on that legislative session and make sure nothing got done, and they won, okay? And they're trying to do the same thing in this session. I think we have to have an outside actor like Berkshire Hathaway come in with a plan just like they came in with. I like that plan. I think it's a good plan. It actually directly addresses the 2 big issues, which are we're going to add 10 gigawatts of additional baseload reserve capacity, and we're going to do it by building natural gas-fired plants, not a bunch of wind turbines that are going to freeze up. And those natural gas plants are going to be fully weatherized, which none of the current ones are, because none of the power generators wanted to invest the money to do it. And all those gas plants are going to have storage for 7 days supply of natural gas fuel on site, which not a single natural gas plant in Texas has today. So it directly addresses exactly what the problems are. It's a proposal by a very substantial company with an awful lot of capital and the ability to go do exactly what they're saying they will do. And it's a company that hasn't been tied up in all the politics around the grid as it currently sits today. So, you know, I mean, am I an advocate for Berkshire Hathaway? No, I don't have any, role with them. I've just been an outside observer in it. But what they're proposing makes an awful lot of sense. And I don't know if there's time in this session for them to get that done. I just don't know. But it at least is a plan to address the real problems, the real issues on the grid, and it's a plan being put forward by a company that has demonstrated it has the ability to get that kind of thing done. So I just have responded positively to it.
And you've changed my opinion on it, actually. And the thing that interestingly changed my opinion fully, other than it was the right thing to do, I thought it was opportunistic without actually talking about the problems. But the way you laid that out, and importantly, the natural gas storage on site, because, and I listened to Robert Bryce's podcast, and he had someone, the author of the book, Shorting the Grid. And in truth, although, whether the wind turbines froze or not, if the wind doesn't blow, they can't generate any power. And if it blows too hard, they can't generate any power. So there is a limit. The natural gas complaint, if you call it that, is if the source natural gas goes away, then they don't have an ability to run. So my issue was, I've always said there's no such thing as a no peeing section in a pool. So So when it was very cold all across the country, natural gas demand went up everywhere. Prices went up everywhere. And for example, in Colorado, we had a $600 million incremental charge from XL. And overall on the XL grid, it was $1.2 billion for natural gas they had to purchase at the spot over those 5 days, which exceeds 10% of their entire 2020 revenue. And so my point on that was, cool, you have the natural gas backup, Warren, but you understand that if it's cold everywhere, we don't have the natural gas supplies, and it's not like we're encouraging more natural gas to come in and having those conversations. But the way you laid it out, it does make sense. The on-site storage, like building gas plants where there is natural storage reservoirs, is very interesting. Is he going to build them, or is he actually putting them where existing gas storage is? Is this incremental storage?
Well, my understanding is that the plants would be geographically spaced throughout the state to be available in each part of the state to fill in where necessary. Whether they're going to be sited next to natural gas storage, existing storage, I don't know. My understanding is they would build the storage in conjunction with the plant. But I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure about that.
But I mean, it's an interesting idea, because again, I think that this ties back overall to the theme that we were talking, which is intellectual consistency. I don't believe that we have a climate emergency. I do believe there is climate change because we are humans. So what we did in the year 1000 was we went in and we went to the forests and we cut down trees to make like lumber to build houses with roofs to protect us from the climate. And then we ate the buffalo. And then we so
and then we shot the ones we didn't eat.
And then so by definition, we humans changed the climate. That's what we do. And we always adapt, whether we adapt to higher temperatures, lower temperatures. It seems like it's a first world problem. I watched the movie over the weekend on Netflix called White Tiger. And it's about an impoverished Indian boy who grows up in the most unbelievably poor conditions. And like his dream job is to be a driver for this rich Indian, and to see 800 million people who basically don't know where their next meal is coming from. I always say to friends who are having a bad day, and I wrote it in the book, you are living the dream of an 8-year-old Bangladeshi sheep herder right now. And so get over yourself and stop worrying about how bad it is that your iPhone cracked its screen. It feels to me like climate change is really a first world problem, because no one in India and no one in China, where they're building massive coal plants and they're supporting a huge population growth and 2.4 billion people, they don't seem to care that much about climate change. It feels like very much a man-made problem in America. What do you think?
No, they don't seem to care much about it. And thanks to stupid agreements like the Paris Accord that we've gotten our country into, we give them a pass on doing nothing and we pay for it ourselves. How smart is that? I mean, that's just insanity. It's the definition of insanity. And I just, have to wonder what the ultimate consequences of doing things like that are going to be.
So let's pivot to lobbying a little bit and trade associations, and in particular API. And API recently came out and supported the carbon credit or carbon tax.
Yeah.
Vicky Holub, notoriously as the only female CEO amongst the big oil ones, who has been lambasted for the Anadarko transaction, but in a diversity and inclusion way, she's kind of untouchable and kind of should be untouchable. She came out and said they don't support the carbon tax. What did you make of API's position? What do you make of the carbon tax? How do you think that this plays out?
Well, and far be it for me to speak for BP or Shell or Exxon. I worked for Shell for a little while, so I know something about thought processes in that company, but never worked for the other two. API has been under pressure from first BP and Shell and more recently Exxon to do something, make a statement about cost of carbon in one form or another since the election of Barack Obama in 2008. There was a great deal of fear that we were going to go to a cap and trade system, as you remember, in the first 2 years of the Obama administration. Thank God that failed. but I think it really scared the major oil companies into determining internally that ultimately there will be a price on carbon. It's either going to be done through a tax or through a cap and trade system. And Exxon's, I think, main reasoning for supporting a tax is that it's much simpler and administratively more efficient to deal with a tax than it would be with a cap and trade system and all the illusory credits and exchanges that, ends up involved in. But when you look at API's membership, once you have 3 of the 5, biggest members lined up in support of one of those concepts, it was inevitable that API would endorse it. And so I think that's what's happened. I applaud Vicky Holub, frankly, for being opposed to it, and Oxy for being opposed to it. And I would hope that IPAA and the big independents would also remain opposed to it, because it's a bad idea. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for energy costs in our country, and I just think it's a lousy idea. But corporations make their own internal calculations and cost benefit analyses that they go through, and that's what those companies have done, and so that's what API ends up doing.
I actually really like that thought, because I hadn't thought too deep enough about it, and so this is the second time in the conversation you've helped really change my mind. I blamed API because I thought that as a trade organization, us constantly taking a knee seems the wrong way to go. But you made an excellent point in that when the people funding your G&A, which pays the employees' mortgages and maybe their second homes and maybe their boat payment and maybe their kids' college, the difference between being paid and having the moral high ground is very, very different. And, right. and I think about that a lot in politics. And I've told this story before, but people have encouraged me. And I think before coronavirus, when I was a little bit less controversial in macro issues, obviously I'm against a lot of the things that we've done policy in it, and it makes me more controversial than it should be. But I thought about running for governor in Colorado. Now, it's a very democratic state. The likelihood of me making people in Boulder like me is probably zero. But the concept was, at least in the middle, where I stand on issues. We're going to have a transparent discussion around it. And then maybe you pull it, instead of being the extremes that we are right now, we build some bridges, we actually govern instead of ramming things down throats. And I was
Wouldn't that be nice?
Wouldn't that be nice? And at the very least, I'd love to be on stage debating Polis about some of the energy policy things, because I think the conversations we're having need to be had. Levelized cost of energy, for example, doesn't include battery cost, which is interesting. The cost to install wind is, per megawatt, but they only blow 20% of the time. So it's understating the cost 5x versus some of the competitors, which a natural gas plant obviously produces the nameplate value. So, there's just some little intellectual tweaks. But the point of this story was, I was told if I put $2 million of my own money in, it would be a good start. And it would show donors, that I am committed, and that they could then put money behind me. And I think running for governor in Colorado is about $8 million. But if I'm going to put $2 million of money in at a 20 to 1, 10 to 1, 15 to 1 shot, in any other investment, I would expect to get 30 million in return. Let's call it 15 to 1. Well, that means that the people who give me the money to cover that need that return in my decisions, which is exactly what API has done. So they're not actually doing the right thing. They're not making the right argument. They're not supporting the industry. They're bending the knee to the money, which is why I always say money in politics is the problem, and it keeps getting more expensive to be a politician. So we think these businesses are magnanimous, and yet Facebook, who screens and censors everything, is also donating to the party, and then somehow miraculously is still protected by, the section 230 protection. So, it's interesting. What do you think of the media and the narrative and politics and money, and where we sit as a society, and what we need to do to not become Rome and fall into the ocean?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that over the last few years, because, and I mean, I think it does all go back to this fundamental change in our news media to being promoters of a narrative rather than reporters of news. So, and I think it was you that actually said this in one of your posts yesterday or day before, that the narrative is more important than the facts. So, and that's now pervasive throughout our entire media. As we talked about earlier, we see now that the news media have all decided jointly, and I assume in conjunction with the Democratic Party, that we are now going to stop using the term climate change and change to now calling it all a climate emergency. So that's the next step in the alarmist strategy to create support for all the socialist policies that the proponents of climate change theory always end up somehow landing on. It always comes down to we need more socialism in our society because climate change. I mean, that's the essential argument. That's the whole argument. When we talk about, I just think, I don't know how you reverse that, because that's what's being taught in our journalism schools now and has been for 20 years. Journalism schools no longer teach reporters how to actually go out and dig and investigate and report real news. They teach reporters that they have to be advocates for something, for typically it's whatever the Democratic Party wants them to be advocates for. How do you change that? I don't know. I don't know how we ever put all this back in the bottle as a society. I don't really think we can. And so that makes me very concerned about the future of this country, the future viability of our current form of government, even because, today we see the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives just this week introducing bills to do away with the Electoral College, which if you do away with the Electoral College, then California and New York will determine who the president is every 4 years. They're going to pack the Supreme Court if they get their way. They're going to do away the Senate filibuster in order to accomplish these things. So this is the most radical period of time our country has ever seen in Washington, D.C. And if you tune in the CBS Evening News last night, the big story was that Prince Harry and Prince William won't be walking side by side at Prince Philip's funeral.
Yeah.
They'll have one of their cousins in between them. That's the big story on CBS News because they don't want to report on any of this other stuff that's actually happening that actually might impact your life. So I don't know. I mean, I've thought a lot about how we put that back in the bottle, and I just honestly don't really see a way to do it. So I'm very worried about what's going to happen over the next decade.
Can you imagine if the role was reversed? With Trump putting through Amy Comey. I always
Amy Coney Barrett.
Amy Coney Barrett.
Yeah.
I always like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I like those names that have David Ramsden Wood. They have bam, they have all these things. But I mean, the amazing thing to me was the true story, I think, of RBG. And whether you liked her or not, she did wonderful things over the course of her life based on what she believed in. And when Obama effectively asked her to resign to ensure that spot would go to a Democratic judge, she was like, no, thank you.
No.
I'm going to outlive Trump for all intents and purposes, even though she didn't know it was Trump at the time, because she knew, like many people who are on the verge of retirement know, that if they retire and they lose their purpose, they will die. And so I give her all the kudos in the world for trying to outlive the Republican president. And I mean, she would have had herself rolled into the Supreme Court in a bed if she needed to, just to get to January 20th. She didn't. And
she almost made it.
And the Republicans did what they wanted. But can you imagine if Donald Trump had said that he was going to expand the Supreme Court to 13 judges, which miraculously, since 6 are Republican and 3 are Democrat, last time I checked, if you go 4 plus 3 is 7, to your point, and the Electoral College is 100% the populations on New York and California, which don't understand what's going on in the Midwest or in Texas.
Right.
Is the country getting too big to govern? And with this mobility of Californians moving to Colorado, Californians moving to Austin, Californians moving to Arizona, Californians moving to Nevada, New Yorkers moving to Florida, because they're all leaving the policies that are currently in place that make no sense, and they're going to Republican states. Are we going to end up with just these hyper echo chambers of like every Republican thinker is going to move to South Dakota? And
I don't know.
like, where do we go?
Yeah, that's actually an issue. I mean, the reason Colorado is a Democratic state now is mainly because so many Californians invaded Colorado since 1990. They've shifted the voting patterns in Nevada. They're shifting the voting patterns in Montana. They're shifting them in Texas. It's, as you say, they leave California to get away from the impacts of the insane policies that their Democrat rulers have pursued for the last 30 years. And then they come to these other states, and what do? Well, they vote for more Democrats. That doesn't seem to make sense. It's not logical to me. But to your question, whether the country's too big to govern, I actually think it's maybe too big and too complex anymore for a centralized government to govern it. And we have lost so many pieces of the federalism on which this country was founded. There's been so much power that should have been left to the states, or to even, further down to local governments, that has now been centralized in Washington, that it becomes really, I think, impossible for bureaucrats who never leave the district to know what the proper thing to do for people in Texas or Colorado or other parts of the country out here in flyover country actually is. So it may just be that it's become too complex for a centralized government to manage. And what really needs to happen is a lot of this stuff needs to be shoved back down to the states. But I just don't think if you have Democrats in control of Washington, that's not ever going to happen, obviously.
No, that's again a very interesting point on the decentralization of government, because the federal government is seen as this power, and and even coming out of, most people watch the national news, not local news. The national news media is run out of New York or LA, and they're making commentary on what Florida's policies are, when many people don't go to Florida, and then they're never chatting about like the overlay of a massively hyper lockdown state of California versus the totally open state of Florida. And you compare and contrast and have an intellectual conversation around it, and they don't exist. It is really interesting. It's something we'll wrestle with. I wanted to close on DAPL, and in particular, again, we've talked about judges, we've talked about the sway of political activism versus judicials. I've said in the past that oil and gas should stop trying to win in the court of public opinion and simply win in the courts, and that we shouldn't be out there in front of anybody.
Which is what Exxon did for a long time and was very successful at doing.
And Chevron beat down the New York Supreme Court, I guess, ruling around, New York City wanted to be paid for Chevron's role in climate change, and that got dismissed. But we have this DAPL ruling, which a lot of people forget. We have almost 600,000 barrels a day going through a pipe that has been running for 3 years, that was approved by the Corps of Engineers. But there was an environmental assessment on a piece of the pipe that goes under a waterway that in the event it would break, there would be losses. Energy Transfer, the owner of the line, has talked about $60 million of cost to keep it not empty, not full. If it was to be shut down, it would stop 600,000 barrels a day, which are currently producing, going through pipeline, which is the safest, and put it on truck and put it on rail, which happened to be owned by Warren Buffett, incidentally. What do you make of what's going to happen with DAPL? The Corps of Engineers said they wouldn't shut it down. The judge gave them 10 more days to talk about it. When this podcast comes out, we'll be very cllose to the decision. What do you would make of it, and where do we go with it?
Boy, I tell you, I don't know what that Judge James Boasberg is the judge in that case. He's a real wild card. I think there's really no way to tell what he might ultimately order. Environmental impact studies on that pipeline that had been conducted and approved by the federal government before it opened. As you said, it was in service for 3 years with,
No,
Can you hear me?
I
Okay.
sure can.
It was in service for more than 3 years before all of this came up early in the year. And I just don't know. I don't have a good feel for where that's ultimately going to end up. I just think the judge is such a wild card that we really can't predict. But the irony here, and what our environmentalists ought to actually be concerned with if they care about the environment, is if that pipeline is shut down, it's going to cause extreme impacts to the environment in a negative way, because the oil's not going to stop moving. It's just going to move on rail cars and trucks instead of in the pipeline. Most of it. Some of it will stop moving, but most of it will just be put on rail cars and in trucks, and which are much less safe ways, much more create much more emissions than a pipeline does. And if you're an environmentalist, why aren't you urging the judge not to shut the pipeline down? This is just another, contradiction of that movement, that they don't really appear to much care really about the environment.
The thing that scares me the most is that everything we're talking about is kind of feelings, not the law. Right. And one of the reasons American companies have created the greatest capitalist structure, and all of our companies that are the biggest in our country are the biggest in the world, is because property rights are a thing. And when you go back to the Constitution, and it was originally based on John Locke's philosophy, which was life, liberty, and property, which was changed from property as opposed to a right. They made it the pursuit of happiness. But property rights are key. And when a permit is approved and when money is spent, which differentiates Keystone Pipeline a little bit. I know you've written on that. I said we'd stop on DAPL, but Keystone's related. But when a company makes an investment, they expect the investment to yield a return. Otherwise, their investors are going to get upset. And so it seems to me that, number one, there must be property laws where a permit issued is a permit issued. And yes, there may have been mistakes, but they can be remedied without shutting the pipeline down. And it seems that's a question of law, not a question of environmentalists impacting a judge. And yet our conversation was all based on who influences the judge the most. That it's an interesting state of affairs.
It is, and it goes to one of my favorite themes in what I write, and I don't know if we're about to run out of time.
No, we have all the time in the world.
It has to do with predictability of regulation and law. And one of the reasons why the United States has become one of the greatest economic engine the world has ever seen, and one of the most attractive places for investment in industries like the oil and gas industry, is because companies had predictability of regulations and laws. They knew what the legal structure was and knew what the regulatory structure would look like, and that enabled them to predict what their return on investment is going to be. And over the past 10, 12 years, we have begun to destabilize all of that intentionally, I think, starting in the Obama administration. And we have begun to lose the predictability in our legal structure and our regulatory structure. And when you do that, it's going to, it causes a lack of investment in the oil and gas industry, which we have seen taking place in this country, because oil companies are much less able to predict what their rate of return on investment is going to be. So it's when you get down to fundamentally, the biggest issue probably facing the oil and gas industry today, it is the destabilization of the legal system in this country. And that's going to mean flight of capital to other parts of the world.
And yet Saudi Aramco, and I think Mike Umbro on LinkedIn has been doing a nice series, sort of like every time we shut down oil from Colorado, we're importing more oil from Saudi, who did this. And I mean, these are just facts that, again, aren't being raised. So you had written on Keystone Pipeline, which is also an interesting one, because TC Energy had built the Canadian pipe. It's important for Canada because, like, if DAPL goes down, then the Dakota Access Pipeline, you're going to have to put things on rail and truck. Canadians are limited with rail and truck. And so not only would we lose rail cars to the loss of DAPL, then Canadian crude, which already uses it because it doesn't have egress down to the coast for the heavy oil, which we need to refine because of our settings. But Keystone on January 20th, executive order canceled. What do you make of Keystone? Was it a trade-off to keep DAPL going? Was it a campaign promise? Does Keystone ever get reinvigorated? Where are we at on that?
Well, the only way Keystone ever gets reinvigorated is to win in the courts, which have been destabilized. So, that'll take years. The great irony of that decision was that Biden, the president, canceled the cross-border permit that had been issued by the State Department. The cross-border piece of the pipeline was built well over a year ago. It's already in the ground and ready to go. Yeah, and what's going to happen is, as you said, it's a negative impact to the environment. The oil that doesn't get shipped down to here on to the Gulf Coast refineries on rail cars and in trucks is going to go into the Trans Mountain pipeline. That's going to take it to the west coast of Canada, and it's going to be shipped to other parts of the world to be refined in countries where their environmental standards are less than what we have here in the United States. So emissions are going to go up. Costs are going to go up, prices for energy are going to go up. And so it's a negative impact all around. But yes, I think it was a payoff to the environmental lobby that funded a great deal of the Biden-Harris campaign. And much of what the Biden presidency has done has been just payoffs to the people that put them in office. And, I guess that's typical. That's kind of classic politics. But when what you do tells a company that had a permit from the federal government, and that company had already invested about $3 to $4 billion in the construction of that pipeline on the full faith that the federal government would live up to the guarantee it had made in issuing that permit. What does that do to the stability of this country and our economy? What does that tell investors that want to invest in the U.S. economy and projects that may someday be unpopular with the in crowd in Washington? I just think it was, not so much just because it was an oil and gas decision, but just the nature of what he did in telling a company, sorry, you invested that $3-4 billion. You just have to go out of business now. I mean, that's just, by doing it by executive fiat that way with an executive order is just, to me, unconscionable. I mean, it's just really a horrible thing in terms of destroying faith in the veracity of the federal government. It's like when we used to, just willy-nilly cancel treaties with Indian tribes that we had made back in the 19th century and still do today, frankly. It's the same kind of thing. You've said you're going to do X, and then 5 years later, the facts change, and oh no, we're going to do Y. It's really a bad way to do business.
Yeah, and I would say broadly, what our country seems to be missing is the dialogue and discussion. And to your point on the news, they're pushing a narrative, whereas all through 2020, instead of us seeing a dialogue between Dr. Fauci and pick your expert on the other side. Yeah. I don't care who it is, but have a congressional hearing with true pros and cons. And instead of canceling Ben Shapiro's appearances at the University of California, people should be standing in line asking clarifying questions. And one of the engagements that you and I had on LinkedIn with a frequent opponent of mine is about dialogue, but facts are very rarely brought to the table. And so when you bring up a fact or whatever, it's called, well, you're ignoring the science, or, blah. Right. And so we pick and choose. We made cigarettes illegal, and yet marijuana is legal, and you smoke it. More than 40% of the country is obese. There was a massive crisis to get soft drink vending machines out of schools when we were kids, and instead we canceled gyms and canceled PE.
And no PE classes.
Sugary drinks in the schools, causing obesity. The inconsistency around what we pick and choose is tough. It's hard not to think of Ayn Rand's book, which unfortunately was the first substantive book I ever read. I think I was 17 when I read it. And so if people wonder where a lot of my libertarian sort of contrarian views came from, that was the first formative book I ever read, Atlas Shrugged. And I do wonder at some point if the productive members of society, not that socialism has everything bad, better education, better medicine would be good, but at what point do we have a massive wholesale shrug of effectively 50% of the population who are individualists versus collectivists? And what does that do? I fear the outcome.
Yeah, I do too. And I mean, it just goes back to the question of how do we reverse all this damage that's been done? And honestly, it really is hard to see a way to do that, and that's frightening.
Well, David Blackmon, where can people follow you? Tell us again about the radio show. Tell us about where you published and your Twitter and or LinkedIn accounts that people can keep up with what you're talking about.
Sure. Well, I'm again at Forbes.com. You can find me. Just go to the website and do a search on my name. It's Blackmon. I'm the editor for Shale Magazine. Our website is shalemag.com. Do a lot of writing there. I'm on Facebook, David Blackmon 5 on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I am not on Twitter. I had a Twitter account and just got so sick of all the vitriol on that platform. A couple of years ago, I got off of there, so you can't find me.
Good for you.
Yeah,
good for you on that.
That's where I am. I'm just too old to do Twitter anymore.
Twitter is it is one of the degenerates of America, where anonymous people can say anything they want without consequence, and that never ends well. I too have deleted my Twitter app, and I still am on it because I read the news, but I'm certainly off Twitter in my mind anyway.
Well, that's good. I'm sure you're a much happier person for it.
I am a happier person, David. I always enjoy our conversations. You really changed my thinking on a couple of topics I'm going to think deeply about, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Wow. I'm honored for you to say that.
You truly did. Thank you. And until next time, if you like what you hear, write a review on Apple, give us 5 stars. That helps spread the word. We don't do this for word. We do this to edutain you. And I appreciate everyone tuning in. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day, and bye for now.